What I'm going to really try and look at is what are the assumptions behind the ideas that we've developed? Where do they come from? How have they developed? Which bits of it are legitimate, and more importantly, which bits aren't? One of the reasons I became quite interested in this particular question related to autism was as a practicing child psychiatrist, and I've been practicing since 1992, so I've got a few years to reflect on how things have changed in the way we think about, talk about, but also the types of cases that are presented to us and the types of framing that are presented to us. So in my early years of being in a training program, I came across two young people who'd had a diagnosis of autism. So in that 3.5 or so years, and both of them were closer to some of the descriptions that Mary mentioned around Canna. They both had significant learning difficulties, and there was very limited amount of language communication that you could have with them. So as the years went on, and particularly as we went into the 2000s, I began to see a rapid expansion in the numbers of people who were being considered for a diagnosis of autism. And then a rapid expansion in the number of people who are receiving the diagnosis of autism, to the point where what sometimes happens in services now is when we have a young person who doesn't respond to the type of therapeutic intervention that we imagine they should respond to, a question often comes up is perhaps they have autism. I'm not sure. In fact, I am reasonably sure that it doesn't actually answer the dilemma of how best to help them. But this is also something that I've seen happen a lot more in schools. As people become more aware of the idea of autism, and as teachers become more aware of the idea of autism, it is being suggested to parents a lot more frequently. So something has happened. And my original interest was in attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And the reason I got into really researching the basis of that was because during my training, ADHD as a concept was just catching on. And so there was an increasing interest in it. And my consultant at the time, this was in about 1993, 94, was very interested, and I was working in Hackney in a very multicultural area, was very interested in carrying out some research around looking at the prevalence and the presentation of ADHD in this multicultural area. So I was given the task and happily volunteered to do the task of doing a literature review. And the thing that became frustrating for me was I was trying to get a handle. What do we mean by ADHD? What is it? And the papers I was reading never seemed to tackle this question, or at least to me, not in a satisfactory way. So I came to the realization that it was an idea, and that through the development of papers talking about ADHD as if it is an already understood, characterized, and identified thing, that it came into being as an identified thing when papers started to talk about these are the features, this is how you classify, this is the prevalence rate, and then you start building programs for treatment based on these criteria. So there was a kind of self-fulfilling loop. It became a thing by people talking about it as a thing, but it was never actually started out as a thing. So I became interested in following that research and trying to understand, is it a thing? So started looking at, the neurobiological and genetic research, and have continued to be interested in that. And I can pretty confidently say that using the appropriate epistemology, which is the scientific method based on falsifiability, that ADHD is not a thing in that sense. It is a thing because it has been constructed as a thing. And as I saw the rates of autism start to increase, I began suspicious to think about, well, is there something around autism? Autism was slightly more complicated because its origins is in children and young people who had good evidence of some sort of neurological compromise. So higher rates of chromosomal abnormalities, of epilepsy, and of significant learning difficulties. So the connection between autism originally and some sort of neurological something going on was a reasonable one. But once I saw it expanding, and once it expanded into the realms of people like Mary was saying, people like Einstein and Marie Curie and Isaac Newton. In fact, if you look at just about any list of the great and the good in most realms, from music to authors to actors to scientists, you will see a huge name cropping up with the suggestion that they may have had an autism. So when I saw this expansion, I wanted to understand the basis of how are we constructing this as a thing. So when we talk about an autism spectrum, a spectrum of what exactly? Yeah. And here's just some basic orientation for those of you who maybe haven't thought about things in this way. And it's kind of a little bit of basic philosophy. So to do with how we classify things. So diagnosis is a system of classification that's essentially based on proximal explanation. So when it works at its best, you might have a fracture of your tibia, for example. You've got pain and swelling. This takes you to the accident and emergency. An X-ray reveals that the cause of your pain and swelling is that you've had a fracture in your tibia. And then you know that you literally have a fracture. It is there, it exists external to the imagination of the diagnoser, and it is empirically verifiable in some way. Once you have something that works in those terms, a type of thing that can be thought of, if you like, as a natural kind, you can build up a set of technical knowledges around that. So you can now start identifying different types of fracture, different features of fractures, different treatment approaches to fractures, the different types of fracture, complications, short-term outcomes, long-term outcomes, and so on. Acute presentations is when diagnosis works at its best. There are other conditions that may not present in that obvious way, like diabetes, for example. But again, the definition of diabetes is a cause-based definition. So it's to do with having your blood sugar too high. There are, of course, lots of debates within medicine about when blood sugar should be considered to be too high, and about when you should start different types of treatments, particularly for the type 2 onset diabetes. And it can also present in a variety of ways. It can present in all sorts of non-specific ways, such as just a tendency to infections. So it can go for a long time undiagnosed. But again, it is something that we can think of as a natural thing. Now, medicine is also full of issues that don't conform to this classification by explanation, which then gives itself to developing a technical knowledge base based around classification by explanation, from various neurological issues to chronic conditions to medically unexplained symptoms. In fact, if you look at, a number of my friends are GPs, and they would say that at least 50% of their work is to do with psychosocial issues. So the medicine has to deal with a lot of things that are not simply can be forced into the thing that most preoccupies us in medical research, which is using the diagnosis, which is a system of classification by explanation. However, when it comes to psychiatry, we actually don't have diagnosis. So to me, this is not something that is open to discussion. It is, to me, it is a basic understanding of taxonomy and epistemology. Because none of the things that we have in psychiatry can be thought of as having explanatory value. And you can realize that quite quickly by just asking a few questions. So for example, in the definition of ADHD, the definition of ADHD is all based on descriptions, which somebody has to then make judgments on. So a description, so there's an idea that whether a child is considered to be overactive or inattentive. So these are descriptions, these are not causes. And you compare that to what is diabetes. Well, as I say, if you just stuck with a description for diabetes, you'd be in trouble as a medical practitioner. So if you said that diabetes is having thirst, going to the toilet a lot, and some sort of generalized fatigue, you would be in trouble as a medical practitioner, because that is not what diabetes is. Several conditions can present like that. In order to define it as diabetes, you have to demonstrate that there is a abnormally high blood glucose. So it is a classification by description. The other way you can discover that what we're dealing with in psychiatry aren't diagnosis is to see what happens when you start to argue that it is a diagnosis. So when people think that if you tell them you've got ADHD, that you've explained their hyperactivity and inattention of their child or themselves, you'd have to ask the question, how do you know that it's ADHD that's caused that? And the only answer you can give to that, I know it's ADHD because you have hyperactivity and inattention. In other words, you get caught in a tautological and circular nightmare. So in psychiatry, it's not just the boundaries that we discuss and that are up to subjective definitions, but the whole thing. All the parameters are created subjectively. There's nothing to anchor it as a thing that exists out there in the real world in a way that can justify our classification system. Is that making sense? You following that? One of the frustrating things about doing presentations over Zoom is you can't see how your audience, whether you're losing them, whether they're still with you. So I shall just carry on. So what would the rest of medicine, another way of understanding this point, which is, I think, really central, is what would the rest of medicine look like if we used this manner of what we call diagnosis in psychiatry in the rest of medicine? So if you went to your doctor with a recurrent cough, what the doctor would do is would sit down with you, take your history, maybe talk to somebody who knows you, take a history from them, and then they would diagnose you with recurrent cough disorder. It would have to have 3 letters because it's either 3 or 4 letters if it's a psychiatric syndrome, and it would have to have the word disorder after it. Yeah. So that's what would happen. If you went with a headache and you said to your doctor, look, I've got a pain in the head, and the doctor went through again, they'd diagnose you with having a headache. Say the headache is the cause of your pain in the head. So this is, to me, the same as saying ADHD is the cause of your hyperactivity. A description doesn't cause itself. Does that make sense? So this is the frustrating thing for the field of psychiatry when it starts to think that that it's just like the rest of medicine and that it can rely on a technical approach to knowledge. As I've said, the rest of medicine has huge limitations when it comes to just relying on technical knowledge, and it's a shame that psychiatry hasn't recognized that, because for me, the contribution of the psi disciplines to the rest of healthcare is to understand that it is a fundamentally human relational practice, and to help the rest of healthcare with the non-technical aspects. So the problem for my profession when it comes to imagining that we have a system based on a technical understanding where we can approach what we think of as the mind, the brain, the psyche, the soul, you choose your words that make sense to you, that we can approach it using the same epistemology that we can use for approaching understanding how the kidney works, is this. There is a big black box between inputs, in other words, our experiences of what happens to us, and outputs, in other words, how we behave and how we experience things. The rest of it, we cannot and have not, either through neuroscience, through psychology, we have not been able to put a definitive we've not been able to analyze it and come to definitive conclusions about the laws of how we function inside through these methodologies. So when we scan the brain, when we're dealing with meanings, it's a bit like trying to understand the story for Breaking Bad by looking at how the electrical inputs into the back of the TV go. There's a big disjuncture. And this is the reality that we have to live with. The reality we have to live with is that when it comes to the workings of our mind, to the way we behave, to how we feel, all we have are interpretive frameworks. All we have are different models, and different models that we use create and produce different types of consequences. So we are constantly in the process of creating and narrating what makes sense to us and how it makes sense, rather than discovering the meanings. So let's have a look at how autism has been socially constructed, and Mary started us off on that journey by noting that actually the initial use of the idea of autism was as a descriptive term, And in some ways, that's probably the most accurate use of the term autism, because it was used to describe rather than diagnose. So it was used to describe a state of mind, and it was the state of mind of psychotic individuals who showed extreme withdrawal from the world around them. So it was Eugene Bleuler who first coined the term schizophrenia, who first used the word autism, if you like, in a more medical setting, and it was as a description. The next one to come along was Kanner, who in 1943 described in a couple of papers what amounted to 11 children who were mainly of middle-class parents who showed what he described as an extreme aloneness. And his papers are very good in terms of, there is very detailed observations. But then it takes a leap of faith. There is some speculation about whether the reason he ended up calling this autistic psychopathology, or eventually autism, was because these parents felt stigmatized by the most common used term of the time, which was mental retardation. So there is some speculation about whether he came up with a new word, because that would have been less stigmatizing for his client group. Then in 1944, there's some very interesting history about the possibility of a connection between Asperger and Kanner, because Asperger was working in Nazi Vienna. And in the years in the run-up to what happened in Vienna during the war, there were a number of Jewish doctors who were working in Asperger's department, who, as the influence of Nazi ideology was spreading, resulted in Asperger being promoted rather than them. And as things got worse for these Jewish doctors, they managed to emigrate, and one of them ended up working with Asperger. So there is a possible interesting connection there. That's just speculation. But some of the recent research is some very shocking history has been unearthed. I would recommend you read this book by Edith Schaeffer if you're interested in how things get constructed historically. But Asperger, he worked in a clinic in wartime Vienna, and part of the work of the clinic that he was working in was to sift out children who were considered to be potentially educatable than those who are considered to be potentially uneducatable. And this concept of a life not worth living, and that the kindest thing to do was to euthanize these people, was around. So Asperger is considered to have damned at least 42 of the young people he was working with to go to this clinic where almost 800 children were essentially killed due to deliberate neglect or lethal overdoses. And the 4 children that Asperger described, he considered them to be potentially educatable. And you have to remember, he is writing at a time in our history where there was a huge interest in Nazi ideology and in Nazi society in human typologies, in how to categorize humans. And this is the kind of zenith of the whole eugenic movement period. And so he was working with children who weren't considered to have significant learning difficulties, but had behaviors that made them considered to have, there was a Nazi concept of something to do with a community spirit, an idea that you'd put aside a kind of individual trait that lent you to working on behalf of your community. And these were considered children who didn't have that. But Asperger described them and suggested they have this autistic psychopathology, but they were potentially educatable. So this is where the concept of Asperger comes from. And as has already been discussed, originally, while the Kanner idea of autism was dominant, it was considered to be an extremely rare condition that affected something like 1 to 4 in 10,000 children. And most of these children would have been considered to have significant learning difficulties. And it was Asperger's ideas, after a paper of his, paper of his was translated originally, I think, by Uta Frith, and then popularized by Lorna Wing, which introduced the idea of Asperger's, and that, together with another British psychiatrist, Michael Rutter, who started looking at autism and came to the conclusion that it was genetic in origin, and he coined the triad that, of language difficulties, social communication impairments, and imagination impairments. That was the traditional triad. And it was the two of them that opened the way to beginning to think of autism away from this very small group of children into the idea that it was a spectrum. But something strange has been happening in research, because the idea that this is a genetic and it's something to do with the development of the nervous system, so a neurodevelopmental condition, has long since disintegrated as an idea. So back in 2016, Gilberg, working with a couple of others, and Gilberg is a well-known autism researcher whose papers go back 20, 25 years, and had been involved in lots of empirical research looking for genetic and neurodevelopmental characteristics, came to the conclusion that ASD research should be disbanded because they're just not getting anywhere. They cannot find any specific genetics. They cannot find any specific parts of the brain or characteristic abnormalities, or even characteristic differences. The other quotations just repeat the same. So what we have instead is an idea that has spread, not because of any discovery, but it has spread because the idea has proved to be of interest. And it's being supported by a belief that it is underpinned by some scientific understanding. This is one of the two ways in which scientism is very much a part of our society and very much a part of the way we've constructed autism. There's two types of scientism. One is the valoration of science, so that things that are not considered to be done using the epistemology of science are considered not to be knowledge worthwhile. So it's the kind of valoration of science as the predominant cosmology and the way that you understand the world around you. But the second type of scientism, which is just as ubiquitous, is that you confuse what is a set of social constructs for being science. So you actually ignore what the science is saying. You ignore some of the essential features of the scientific methodology, which is falsifiability. So in scientific epistemology, you start with the assumption that whatever your hypothesis is, isn't true. And you have to prove that this idea that it isn't true can't be maintained. So you have to start, when it comes to autism, with the assumption that there is no such characteristic, neurological or genetic thing called autism until you can show that this cannot be the case. It is not the other way around. It is not up to people like myself who critique the concept of autism and say that it doesn't hold together to come up with the evidence that it doesn't hold together. It's the other way around. If you promote an idea that autism is a thing and that it is something neuro about it and possibly something genetic about it, it is up to those who promote that idea to demonstrate that that is based on an empirical basis. I won't go through all the genetic studies or the neuroimaging studies, just to tell you that it's come up empty. What the findings are in genetics, that there are hundreds of genes scattered across the genome, but when you control for learning difficulties, even these small and rather insignificant differences start disappearing. And exactly the same in neuroimaging studies. A consistent lack of consistency is the predominant picture. Whenever one area or one set of characteristics is proposed and other teams try to replicate it, it doesn't seem to lead anywhere. And particularly, again, when you control for learning difficulties. And this problem of lack of replicability has bedeviled the literature, when the biological literature, which remains the dominant way in which autism, ADHD, and these non-diagnoses in psychiatry are researched, it remains the dominant way. And in some ways, so from that point of view, as far as autism existing as a natural thing out there beyond our imagination, somewhere in the bodies or brains of the people who get the label or could get the label, the evidence cupboard is empty. So we have to assume that is it doesn't exist in that form. And the fact that it doesn't exist in that form as things stand is perhaps not surprising, because what is it that you think is the characteristic that defines autism? And this comes back to a question that, in a way, Marie was raising, which was, what is the spectrum? What is it a spectrum of? And how do you locate it? And how far are those who have the diagnosis of autism similar, and how far are they different? And the differences can be enormous if you start to read through and deconstruct the different types of symptomatologies, to use that awful medicalized language, that may attract a diagnosis. So if you look at any of the bits that are thought to be connected to autism, just take, for example, poor social reading. Well, in technical terms, you'll find that in diagnoses, or what I call pseudo-diagnoses, as diverse as language disorders, ADHD, anxiety, depression, personality disorders, attachment disorder, etc. But also you'll see it in various other contexts, from the sense of alienation, being an immigrant with one set of cultural norms, coming into a society with a different set of cultural norms, deliberate provocation, boredom, is a strong desire for love. How good are we at social reading when we're in love, and so on. So there's a big spectrum in each of the things, and even poor social reading itself can be deconstructed into smaller and smaller parts. So where is this spectrum? How do we define it? And this has been one of the problems that's bedeviled research as well. So a long time ago, one of the lead researchers, Hughes, came to the conclusion, because the combination of symptoms in those who get diagnosed in research terms is so different, that she and her team decided just to look at each individual of the triad separately and start researching them as if they were individual disorders, not all part of the same thing. And later from that is now being deconstructed. And in terms of outcomes, if we start including people like Einstein at one end of this spectrum, and if we go down to people who have significant learning difficulties and are just unlikely to be able to live independently without a great amount of support, and who maybe never develop capacity for speech, you've just about got the whole human spectrum. So it's hard to consider that people across the spectrum would have the same needs or the same requirements, the same type of help. So as a label that might be clinically useful, it's very hard to see how it can do anything other than a lot of the time result in a stereotyped approach that risks missing the differences and the huge number of differences that people who have or might have that label might possess. So I want to put my mast clearly in the ground that, as far as I can see, it is an empirical statement to say that autism is a fact of culture and not a fact of nature. So why have we had such a dramatic rise in the idea of autism, in the numbers being diagnosed with autism, and in the various types of movements, from neurodiversity to the more medical end of things, examining, talking about, and trying to make sense of autism? What is it that brings about such a social construct? What does it tell us about our society, about the norms we construct, about the demands that we have on people? Interestingly, Mary said that in some parts of the world, the rates of diagnosis have gone up to about 1 in 25 children. This is an enormous expansion in a very short space of time. What's going on for us to take that, and for us to be witnessing such a change? Has it been helpful to people? How many people have been helped? Here's just a couple of figures that from a audit that was done in my county back in 2018. They came to the conclusion that 1.6% of the pupils in our county are recorded as autism as their primary health condition. And also national figures from a national audit found that of adults who had an ASD diagnosis, only 15% were in full-time employment. And as a child psychiatrist, I seem to see an increasing number of children who are unable, unwilling, I don't know what the right term is to use, to go to school. I don't know what that, who have a diagnosis of autism. So I don't know what that says about the dynamics around that, or around what's going on in our schools and the types of pressures. But I seem to be seeing an expanding number who are having that. Now, there's something quite interesting about how we get these diagnostic inflations of things that are not a diagnosis. So the certain labels in psychiatry seem to be very vulnerable to diagnostic inflation. So amongst children, ADHD was the first one that grew rapidly. Autism has followed in its wake. And it predominantly seems to be, if you like, the predominant clientele, which is not the only group, seems to be children and young people who are considered to have behavioral problems that adults are finding hard to manage. When we go to adults, the predominant clientele for psychiatric and psychotherapeutic services tend to be women, and tends to be around, I mean, these are just generalizations, always have to be careful with generalizations, but they tend to be around issues to do with mood, anxiety, thoughts about the self, and relationship difficulties. But as diagnostic inflation happens, what we found is that diagnoses that were more thought of as an adult diagnosis and considered very rare in childhood, such as depression, have migrated into childhood. So depression is now a very common diagnosis in childhood services. It used to be considered extremely rare. And the opposite has happened, that autism has migrated into adults and ADHD has migrated into adults. And interestingly, their diagnostic features have been reconstructed along the lines that that they are. So there is this idea of masking, and with ADHD, there is this idea of disruption in the sense of self, and problems in relationships, all sorts of things that were not in the diagnostic criteria in childhood, but kind of open it up into where the markets are in adulthood. So we see some interesting things as things are being reconstructed. So what is it about our culture, our society, in what some people would call late capitalism, that makes us so, makes these ideas likely to catch and to become profitable, both metaphorically and literally, and to spread? So I think we're in a culture, so this is more some of my speculations, just a little bit of my speculations. I think we are now in a culture which has become very individualist, consumerist, and it sections us into looking inwards to have a sense of who we are or what our meaning is. So we're in a culture that's very interested into creating ideas of human typologies. And a lot of these human typologies are then lend themselves to the process of branding. So I no longer think of what we call psychiatric diagnoses as diagnoses. I think of them as brands, because they are in their natural life outside of the clinic and in society more broadly, they function in terms of how popular they become or how much people look to them. They operate in the same way that most consumables do in a marketplace. So the popular brands, like, as I was saying, when it comes to children, ADHD and autism, will grow. Popular brands that don't appeal to consumers, like conduct disorder or attachment disorder, will still have a market, but it's going to be narrower, and it's going to find it much harder to expand outwards into the consumables, where much more profit can be made. And as Mary was saying, those profits come from all sorts of directions, from people setting themselves as experts, from setting up specialized clinics, from writing books, from making courses. Soon you get institutions. So this is an idea that has been around for a while. Ian Hacking is probably the most well-known person who's articulated how these processes develop a kind of momentum of their own once they become brands. So it's not just that we develop a system of classification, but once that enters into the public marketplace, those classifications start to have a direct impact on how we imagine ourselves and how we imagine the people around us. So it kind of contributes to creating the sorts of people, because we're all made up of so many different moving parts. There are always different bits of us in relation to what's happening in our lives, and in relation to the meaningful relationships and meaningful events. There's always different parts of us that we can highlight. And as we highlight those parts, they then have knock-on effects in terms of these classifications. And the more we talk about these things, and the more we have books, the more likely then you are to get funding for research, more likely you are then to set up, be able to set up institutions that do this, or teams who are going to write more books, who are going to, and the more people have these labels, the more they talk about them, the more they identify with them. And it starts to construct something that goes well beyond the confines of the clinic and begins to affect our discourse much more broadly. And I think the sorts of things that capture our public imagination as constructs, as classifications, as kinds of people that we're constructing, are quite interesting, because they may reveal something of our cultural or political preoccupations. So one of the things that has been written about is the medicalization of emotions. On the one hand, there's a valorization of the idea of emotional intelligence. So there's this idea that the people who are best to run services and to be good leaders and to work with and to understand our politics are people with this kind of special sort of emotional intelligence. On the other hand, we live in a culture which is encouraging us to imagine that mental illness lies just around the corner, and that we have to intervene early. And we're in the middle of a pandemic of mental disorders and mental distress. So there is also another strong discourse which is around a fear of emotions and an idea of the danger that emotions hold for us, that makes it hard to keep the intensity of our emotional experiences within the boundaries of what we would consider ordinary and or understandable. Another strong political change that's happened, which is related to our economics, is that over the last couple of decades, our job market has moved away from the manufacturing sector and towards the service sector. And the service sector is very much around the customer facing abilities, your ability to market not just your product, but how good you are at marketing yourself. So even ourselves now are kind of branded. How do we brand ourselves? How do we imagine ourselves? And how do we fit in to what the job market expects of us? It expects increasingly a certain way of interacting with the public, and it expects of our managers a certain way of managing people that is that effectively is about how we use our social skills in order to manipulate people to do what we want them to do. Now, that was much less the case while we had a job market that was not so public facing, where it was not so involved with your ability to marketize your product and yourself. And where does neurodiversity fit into all of this? I am of the opinion that neurodiversity, as Marie picked up, is a bit of a nonsense word. I mean, I don't know what it means, because if everyone is neurodiverse, no one is. It's neurodiversity of what? Which aspect of us? How do we make sense of that? Now, as a concept, it has provided refuge for a group of people who have been stigmatized and marginalized, and it has allowed for a certain community, and it has allowed a voice to create a type of resistance, which is a resistance against the medicalization and the disorderization of difference. But I also think there is a potential issue, and I'm not saying this is an either or, but I want to put this as something else we need to think about. Neurodiversity is just as vulnerable to, so the idea of difference is just as vulnerable to commodification, because it locates something beyond the individual to some idea of something being fundamentally different inside the person. And so this is about the broader discussion at the moment in society around identity and so-called culture wars. One of the problems that some people point to the focus on identity is that it's gestural. So it allows the big corporations, for example, to put up statements that they are, pro-BLM, but at the same time, they're refusing to allow their workforce to unionize. So this is just an easy win. It doesn't really help change anything about the structures. It can set up separate interest campaigns, and it becomes potentially, it may produce problematic ideas for intragroup differences or intersectionality, as we're talking about. Which is the predominant identity? How do we sit them all? Which are the campaigns? Do all the campaigns go together? Is there an overarching umbrella? Or are they separate? And there is then a concern, particularly, for example, with neurodiversity and its recent things around its intersection with gender. So the construct of female autism, how much does that promote ideas about gender that in themselves are stereotyped? So, why can't women be, if you like, systematizing as a, we have this theory of the extreme male brain, that it's about the capacity to systematize is something related to that male. So is that not a way of constructing gender to say that there are gender performances that are that should be considered normative, and other gender performances that require another label in order to. Ginny Russell, I think, talks about pariah gender identity roles. So this idea that gender roles conform to certain ideas, and if we're labeling people who don't perform to those gender stereotypes as being neurodiverse or autistic, is that not just actually limiting our idea of diversity rather than promoting it? And so I'll just end on this thought in relation to identity and identity politics and the culture wars. And it's just a contrast between the concept of allies and the old-fashioned concept of comrades. So an ally is constructed as something to do with an understanding of your identity, and that other people who are not part of your identity can't speak on your behalf, but they can ally to your cause. So in this version, you recognize that some people are a member of your community of identity, but others aren't. But they can support you in your struggles. Whereas Comrade, which I think points much more towards, if you like, a class-based understanding or an economic and structural-based understanding, points towards a universality of human emancipation. And it implies that we are all together as part of the same struggle. And it requires a stronger sense of belonging to each other rather than separation into groups. And we can all speak on behalf of each other. Now, again, I'm not setting these up as absolute opposites, but more as something that we might want to take into account in further discussions.